So today we're going to start delving into what is often called the classic period of the weird, running from about the mid-1920s to the early 1940s. And the author who in the popular imagination is most associated with this genre, with the popularization of it and with the codification of it as a separate subgenre of fiction, is Howard Phillips Lovecraft. Now, one indication of just how deeply Lovecraft's version of the weird has penetrated the popular psyche is if we look at the number of times that his most famous creation, Cthulhu, has been parodied. We have here an illustration from a Dr. Seuss version of the Call of Cthulhu that someone very cleverly put together, right? We also have, I don't know if any of you are familiar with the card game Flux, right? There's a Cthulhu Flux version. There are board games based on the Call of Cthulhu and on Lovecraft's oeuvre more general. There's a role-playing game called Call of Cthulhu. Now, much of what we think about Lovecraft and about the figure of Cthulhu come not from his own work, but really sort of from the work of lesser successors and imitators like August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, who rather infamously composed a number of what they called posthumous collaborations. They took some notes that Lovecraft had left over at his death and composed new novels like The Lurker at the Threshold out of them. They also really kind of took control of Lovecraft's work after his death and started publishing it through their own specialty publishing house called Arkham House, named for Arkham after the fictional town in Massachusetts, where many of Lovecraft's most famous stories are set. One thing that publishing Lovecraft only through Arkham for so long did was originally it was a response to the lack of respect that Lovecraft got from mainstream publishers. But it also meant that because his stuff was coming out only from a small specialty press, it wasn't circulating as widely as it could have been. Certainly not as widely as it did when it first appeared in magazines like Weird Tales. So let's talk a little bit about the publication history of this particular story, which is probably the first story of Lovecraft's mature, genuinely weird phase, after he sort of graduated from a period of writing Lord Dunsany-influenced Orientalist fantasies. So a lot of Lovecraft's work, as I said, first appeared in a magazine called Weird Tales. And Weird Tales was published in its initial incarnation from 1923 to 1954. It was what was called a pulp magazine. Now, what this meant was, printed on cheap paper, inexpensive, aimed primarily at a working class audience, certainly not at a sophisticated literary audience. So, in its most sort of imaginatively important period, in its most fertile creative period, the magazine was edited by a guy named Farnsworth Wright. And Wright was actually a really good nurturer of talent in fantastic writers. People like Lovecraft, people like Robert E. Howard, people like Clark Ashton Smith. But he was also a very exacting editor with very high standards. Lovecraft often wasn't willing to meet all of Wright's standards. He sort of maintained a sort of gentlemanly New England artistic integrity stance and didn't want to alter his work just to get paid. Other writers like Robert E. Howard were often sort of less scrupulous about this, and their classic tales owe a great deal to Wright's revisions. Lovecraft's not so much. If Wright rejected one of Lovecraft's stories or suggested revisions, Lovecraft often just didn't resubmit. Most of what Weird Tales published would fall generally into what we call the horror genre. But they also published fantasy and detective tales. But those fantasy and detective tales usually included some kind of weird element. And Weird Tales was purchased not always so much for its contents or for its literary contents as for the vivid, often lurid art on its covers and inside its pages. In particular, the Chicago-based artist Margaret Brundage painted a number of very sexually explicit covers for Weird Tales in the era before censorship really kind of cracked down on what they could and couldn't do on a cover. I'll give you an example of a Weird Tales cover in a moment. We'll also look more specifically at what Weird Tales artwork looked like next time we talk about Robert E. Howard. But yeah, this is an important platform for writers in the weird, like the aforementioned Lovecraft, Howard, Nash, and Smith, as well as August Derleth and Robert Bloch. Robert Bloch is best known for writing the novel Psycho, which was then made into the Hitchcock movie. So this is what a fairly typical Weird Tales cover looked like, right? The cover story here is a reprint of H.P. Lovecraft's Shadow over Innsmouth, and we have a pair of fishmen here carrying the unconscious body of a human being off into the sea with them. This is one of the less explicit covers. We'll talk more about the explicit covers next time. All right, so a couple of important influences on the Call of Cthulhu. First, a dream that Lovecraft had in 1920 in which he took a sculpture that he had made himself to an antiquarian in a museum, to a museum curator, and the curator was horrified by recognizing some kind of ancient eldritch evil in it, right? So he has this dream that's very vivid, that he remembers very, very vividly, and this forms the basis for a scenario that he later wants to concoct, particularly the Wilcox portion of the Call of Cthulhu, right, where the artist makes this bas-relief with this octopoid figure and this indecipherable ancient lettering. He also experienced, while he was living in New York City in 1925, an earthquake, which provides the inspiration for that sort of small cataclysm in the Call of Cthulhu, right, as Relea rises up out of the sea, but no one knows that's what's happening except all these artists who are having these weird dreams, right? He was sitting with a couple of other writers and poets at the time the earthquake hit. And so the idea occurs to him, hey, what if I have some sort of natural disaster happen and it triggers something in artistically sensitive people? Now, there are some strong literary influences as well. He was working at the time on an essay called Supernatural Horror in Literature. It's a long essay. In this essay, he provides his definition of what a weird tale is. We looked at that briefly at the beginning of the course. We'll revisit it again today in a moment. He had also been reading a book by Margaret Murray. It's a work of sort of pop anthropology called The Witch Cult in Western Europe. It's published in 1921. Now, Murray in some ways was a really kind of impressive figure. She was one of the first English women ever to be granted a lectureship at a university. And this is the work for which she's most remembered. Now, her basic argument here, and it follows along the lines of the work of people like James Frazer in The Golden Bough. Her basic argument is that into the 17th century, there existed in Europe, mostly in rural places, a pagan witch cult that worshipped a horned god. And the witch trials in the 16th and 17th centuries were the church's sort of final suppression of this secret witch cult. Now, Murray's work has largely been discredited today. No one really takes this book all that seriously anymore, but in Lovecraft's day it was a big deal and it was hugely influential. So from this book, he gets the idea of these Cthulhu cults working all over the world, particularly in very remote places, to bring the island of Relaya back up from the depths of the ocean and to awaken dread Cthulhu from his slumber. And that's an image of the title page of the witch cults in Western Europe. He'd also been reading a lot of detective fiction, especially Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes. And this is a point that I want to sit on and explore in a little bit more detail later. The similarities between a Lovecraftian weird tale and a Sherlock Holmes story. And also where they diverge from each other. Alright, so that's Lovecraft himself as a bespectacled young man. So let's talk a little bit about this essay that he was working on from 1925 to 1927, Supernatural Horror in Literature. So at the same time he's writing The Call of Cthulhu, he's working out his idea of what exactly a weird story is, and sort of trying to imagine where he fits into the history of horror writing. The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its object, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. So what makes a horror story weird for Lovecraft is, as we've discussed, the inability of the human perceptual and conceptual apparatus to fully comprehend what's happening to it, and the sense of powerlessness in the face of things that, according to the ordinary laws of physics, geology, biology, what have you, should not exist. Right? I think there's a Metallica song from the Master of Puppets album called The Thing That Should Not Be, which is actually based, by the way, on Lovecraft stories. But yeah, that's what the weird involves for Lovecraft, right? All sorts of things which should not be. Not always monsters. Some of the things that should not be, for example, are architectural. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, Lovecraft's basic philosophy, which is worked out in many of his weird tales, is often referred to as cosmic indifferentism. So the first premise of this is that the universe is entirely material. There are no spiritual essences in the universe. Everything is matter. No gods, no angels, no devils. The monsters from deep space that Lovecraft's narrators encounter are not supernatural creatures. They don't operate by the same natural laws that Earth creatures do, but their existence is 100% material. Human beings, in this philosophy, occupy only a small portion of cosmic space. Right? We imagine ourselves at the center of everything because it makes us feel important, and because our perceptions are extremely limited, right? Are limited to what's right in front of us. If we became aware of everything else that was out there and just how tiny we are in the grand cosmic scheme of things, it would drive us mad. In a lot of ways, this is an update of Edmund Burke's idea of the sublime, right? This idea that the sublime is that which strikes you with awe and makes you feel tiny and powerless. Lovecraft's cosmic indifferentism is, in a way, a kind of universal sublime, right? It's the cosmic sublime. The size of the scope of the cosmos, if you were to realize it, would make you feel so small that you lose your mind. This cosmos is also completely indifferent to human existence. It doesn't care about people. Creatures outside of the earthly sphere pursue agendas of their own. With no intent necessarily to help or harm us unless we get in their way. And to follow up on the first point of the material universe, right, what we take to be supernatural in Lovecraft's tales is merely human misunderstanding of alien biology, alien technology, or alien motivations. To a creature like Cthulhu, or other Lovecraft creations like Yog-Sothoth, these extremely powerful extra-dimensional beings, humans don't really enter into their scheme of reasoning. One of the things that makes them so terrifying to us is that we don't have any understanding of what they want. We think we do, or characters in these tales think they understand the motivations of these creatures, and often think they're helping them. But they really have no idea what they're about. And anyone who worships Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth as a god has misunderstood the nature of the creature. So there's actually a good quote from Carl Sagan, the great astrophysicist, that sums up cosmic indifferentism pretty well. The universe seems neither benign nor hostile, merely indifferent to the concerns of such puny creatures as we. So because the alien creatures in Lovecraft exist outside of our conception of how things are supposed to work, we can regard them as uncanny. Right? And there are various features of alienness in the Call of Cthulhu that call up the uncanny for us. There's uncanny language, for example. When Wilcox describes his dream to Professor Angel, hieroglyphics had covered the walls and pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy would transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatarim. Now, his ears catch the sound, right? But because it's made by voices that are not human, like Cthulhu Fatarim and other such translations or transliterations of the language of the old ones, right, are attempts to render in a human alphabet, in human language, sounds that the human organism is not the human vocal apparatus is not capable of reproducing. Architecture is uncanny here as well, right? We have architecture that should not be. As Johansen and his men are fleeing from the island, Parker slipped as the other three were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas of green-crusted rock to the boat, and Johansen swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there. An angle which was acute, but behaved as if it were obtuse. Now, it's virtually impossible for us to visualize this, right? Because an acute angle and an obtuse angle are opposite things. Right? right? They kind of cancel each other out. So what Johansen is trying to describe is something that our normal rules of mathematics and proportion don't cover. We have no concept of how the architecture of Relaya actually operates. Right? It looks like it's supposed to behave one way, but behaves another way. And biology, the makeup of the creature itself, right? The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. Whatever Cthulhu is, whatever Cthulhu looks like, it's so outside of the realm of normal biology that Johansen cannot put it into words. The best he can do is say that a mountain walked or stumbled. Notice the conditional here, right? A mountain walked or stumbled. Even the way it moves, the way it behaves, is not quite decidable. And here Cthulhu rises, straight out of Relaya. Now, what all of this means is that these Cthulhu cultists have got it all wrong, right? They misunderstand the nature of the thing that they worship. To quote from old Castro's narration to Inspector Legras, right? Then, whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols, which the great old one showed them. Idols brought in eras from dark stars. That cult would never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priests would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as the great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated old ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with a holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadow forth the prophecy of their return. So the cult's philosophy is a sort of extreme version of that put forth by Friedrich Nietzsche in books like Beyond Good and Evil. But the real misconception they've got here is that once the great old ones are reawakened, right, they are going to help those human beings who serve them be like them. Right? They're not. They don't care about human beings. Human beings are not important to them. Whatever their motivations are, human beings can't grasp them, or certainly don't grasp them. They're not going to repay the service of those who worship them. Right? If old Castro and his fellow cultists, or if the crew of the Alert, showed up on Cthulhu's island, they'd meet the same fate as Johansen's men. Nevertheless, they continue to work at keeping the secret. Right? We know that at least 3 characters are murdered by the cult for knowing too much about their activities. First, Professor Angel. Right? The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking Negro. the sailor Gustav Johansen, back at home in Oslo. 2 Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet, but before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. Now, one thing to note here, and this is a portion of the kind of uncomfortable racism of Lovecraft's work. Both of these men are killed by non-white sailors. And by and large, the Cthulhu cult is made up of either people from remote non-white cultures. There's what they call a group of degenerate Eskimo who worship Cthulhu. The people worshiping Cthulhu in the Louisiana Bayou are described as mostly mixed race, as are those who are aboard the Alert. That Lovecraft seems to associate Cthulhu worship with race mixing somehow. The final character, whom we know has been murdered by the cult, is the narrator himself. Right? He says towards the end, "Let me pray that if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity and see that it meets no other eye." Now, the fact that we're seeing his manuscript at all indicates to us that he has not survived it, that he too has died. And because we have been taught through the story what happens to those who knew of the Cthulhu cult, to those who know its secrets, reading the story by its logic, right, if we accept its world, puts us in danger too. We are also in on the same secrets that got these 3 men killed. And so that's where the real terror in this story comes from, right? Is the sense that you should be looking over your shoulder now because the Cthulhu cultists are coming after you. And artist's conception of Cthulhu idol. Enjoy. So the bottom line here is that knowledge is dangerous. Right? Awareness of anything that goes on beyond our limited human perceptual shores is likely to get you in trouble. Right, at the beginning of the story, we have this relatively lengthy quote here. "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But someday the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age." So what the narrator is telling us, that the only thing that saves us from despair and madness is the fact that we know so little about the world we live in or its place in the wider cosmos. If we had any clue what was really going on or where we really stood in the grand scheme of things, we would either revert to barbarism or go mad. And I think this is one of the interesting places where Lovecraft diverges from the traditional detective stories. In a lot of ways, The Call of Cthulhu is a detective story, right? It's based on, or this basic premise, right, is of an investigation, right? A person of high intelligence seeking out clues, correlating them to make a whole picture of a case. So in that sense, it resembles traditional detective narratives like Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes or Poe's stories of Monsieur Dupin, right? The Purloined Letter and the Murders in the Rue Morgue. Now, what a traditional detective story does is use reason to find logical causes for some apparently supernatural occurrence. Right? So, I don't know how many of you have ever read The Hound of the Baskervilles, or at least maybe seen the movie, right? Now, it's believed in the local community that this legendary hellhound that is the result of some curse laid on the progenitor of the Baskerville line is responsible for a group of murders. But Holmes uses his powers of deduction to show that this hellhound is an ordinary dog. So what the traditional detective does is restore order to a chaotic situation, right? Belief in the supernatural makes everything go topsy-turvy, but once the detective comes in and figures out what's going on, everything is restored to rights, and the criminal element is purged from the community. Now, the Lovecraftian investigator is a little different. What the Lovecraftian investigator does is piece together apparently disconnected fragments of esoteric lore that are often discovered almost by accident. Right? For example, the narrator in this story finds out about Johansen simply by glancing at a piece of shelf paper that catches his eye. So it's almost as though he's guided to find these pieces of information not by his own powers of reason, but by some kind of outside force pushing him along. And these investigators will usually stumble on some kind of awful secret accidentally. This secret puts them in grave personal danger. And the discovery, once the cat's out of the bag, can neither be explained nor can it be neutralized. There is nothing the narrator can do about Cthulhu. Right? He hasn't even written this story to warn you. He warns his executors not to let this information get out, because sharing this knowledge with people is more dangerous than keeping it secret. So once the chaotic element is released out into the world, there's no stopping it. There's nothing you can do about it. It is out there. You can't put the cat back in the bag, or you can't put Cthulhu back in the tomb. All right, so that'll do it for our discussion of the Call of Cthulhu. You're going to be reading 2 Robert E. Howard stories for next time. The very first Conan story, The Phoenix on the Sword. And just so you know, like, the Conan stories are not written in chronological, they're not a sort of chronological recounting of his career. So you'll see a very young Conan in the Tower of the Elephant. You'll see a mature Conan in The Phoenix and the Sword. The Phoenix and the Sword is the earliest written story. So first, I want you to look at the way Howard sets up a dichotomy between civilization and barbarism. Right? This is the primary conflict in most of his stories. What are the positive and negative features of each, and which do you think these stories seem to favor? Secondly, I want you to think about the way Howard's stories are similar to Lovecraft's. Or where do they seem to link up with each other? They were published in the same magazine and are assumed to take place in the same basic universe at different stages in history. So look for linkages, look for similarities there. Also, Howard spends a lot of time focused on detailed physical description of Conan's body. What does this suggest about what he wants us to think are Conan's most important attributes? And why does he need to make Conan so physically concrete for us? And finally, I want you to look at the way magic and those who use it function in these stories. Are magicians to be admired or to be shunned and feared? And so what? All right, so that'll do it for our discussion of our first classic weird author. Classic weird author number 2 up next. See you then.